Wow. Okay, we're in YouTube.
Yeah, here we are. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining from the Americas. Welcome to a new webinar, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Will, CTO at Circontech, an AWS partner based in Latin America, where we help companies design and implement AI solutions. And with me is Victor, who I'll let him introduce himself.
So I'm CTO and founder of Tucson Advisories. I've been working in fintech for probably the last 10 years in different companies. I've been CTO in 3 different unicorns in Europe, providing from like FX, currency exchanges to crypto to lending. And nowadays I'm an advisor for multiple companies and investors on the fintech space.
Perfect. Thank you. So what we are going to cover today in this session named AI in Production, it's the governance gaps that turn AI programs into audit risks and the cost structures that turn promising pilots into budget problems. So here is how the session is structured. We'll start with the enterprise reality, the specific pressures that make AI adoption in regulated industries different from what a vendor can describe. From there, we'll go into what governance that actually works looks like in production. Then we'll move into costs, where the money actually goes and what architectural decisions are important to have control of the AI spend. And then we'll close with some Q&A and some final thoughts. So let's get into it. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you. So, well, we're gonna first of all get started a bit more. What are enterprises really facing today when they are trying to adopt AI within their products, right? And I think the first thing is like when we often talk about AI, we normally think on 2 things: on whether you're using AI for productivity, which is normally whether you're using some agentic solution to create code or to automate customer service, or but not in a way that is part of your product, but it's just like your back office services, right? And the other one is whether you are using it to actually improve your product. So today, really, we're going to focus on the last one, which is how you use it for your product. And there are its own category of problems that enterprises are facing on adopting AI for productivity, but this we probably leave for another webinar. So today, talking about like, okay, I wanted to kind of supercharge my products, and how do I go around differentiating, and how can I do that within regulated enterprises? You would probably, I think, or both of our experiences, what you see a lot of people is that on proof of concepts that did not make it to production and did not show any return on investment, right? But why is this, right? So often you go back to like, well, it's just because it's hype, right? Like AI is so hyped, there's no real value there. But in reality, I think when we looked into the detail, it tends to be more around that AI adoption has become a bit of a top-down mandate, where you have C-level sponsor of the company that wants to kind of showcase that the company is innovating, and they want to be able to produce something quickly. And often, you do that because one of the things with AI is that you can move into a proof of concept really quickly, but the gap between that and production is quite large. And nobody's really thought about it and knows how it's supposed to work once you reach production. And so that's kind of one of the main issues. And these things about like how does it work when you get into production, really, especially around regulated enterprises, whether it's fintech or health tech or anything where you have a regulator that is checking what you're doing, very often it's around the data. So the data is the main, it's both the crown jewels of the company, but it's also the main regulated material, right? Like, are you sharing data that because it's PII or sensitive data, or, has a material impact on the financial exposure, things like credit card details or stuff like that? Or, in Europe, where you talk about the AI Act, are you using it to make decisions whether part of your regulated environment or domain where it can be thought to be discriminated against someone, right? So you need to be very careful how you're using this data. And this is where people haven't really thought it through, right? We go to a POC, we want to put it into production, and then really normally compliance pulls out the brake and goes, this is not data you can share, not also with a third party. And often when you look into those third parties, which, when you talk about AI, mainly they are US-based companies, which is fine, right? But for European-based companies, for example, which I normally tend to work, there is a question about like data traversing and being stored in a different location. I think this is normally the biggest concern. And most of them, well, they don't use your data for train, or you can opt out. There's always some like small print around keeping data retention for debugging purposes, support, logging purposes, and you end up finding that prompts and data is sort of being stored somewhere temporarily, right? And that sort of, well, it's not compliant, and you start thinking, well, can I really actually use this provider, right? And in order to figure this out, you need to kind of go to your regulator or your compliance team and ask them, what do you think, right? And the main thing that they will say to you is, what does it do, and does it do it all the time the same, right? And well, it's AI, so that by default is non-deterministic. So this, while it's great that it's like that and not a problem, it really goes, not against, but really sort of tangential to what we're used to in these industries, which is, how do you control this system? So you make sure that you put an input and you get some output, and you validate that process, you certify that process, and then you are certified, right? And then your auditor or your regulator is happy because you understand that process. But here, you have an input, the output is not always going to be the same. And it breaks the system of controls that have been designed around regulated entities to keep us within check and keep us, auditors and regulators happy with what we're doing. So this is new, and we need to think about, okay, this is a new paradigm. How do we work with that? So normally it relies on internal compliance teams to kind of evaluate it, go more in depth on these providers. And the reality is that these compliance teams either become, or procurement teams become, a bottleneck or become heavily overloaded, where, the expectation is that, especially for CTOs like myself, is that you adopt AI and you do it fast and you move forward fast, right? But this becomes an issue because, like there isn't a process to adopt the AI quick, right? There is a lot of hurdles and assessments that need to be taken into place before you can actually go into the production environment where you can start solving problems, right? So not only you cannot really consistently say this is how we treat it, or this is how we work, that also you cannot consistently say how it's going to fail, meaning that normally when, as a CTO, when I'm evaluating a technology, I know that, well, it's going to do A, B, and C. Worst case scenario, I can mitigate it, that stops working and I have a backup. But in this case, more often than not, it's not so much is it going to stop working, it's what is it going to do, right? Maybe it sets the wrong payment, sets the wrong payment timing, that's something I wasn't expecting, right? So the errors are not so much a 404 or 501 of like the system is not working, you don't have access. Here it's more about something that looks like it's working, and you might not figure out that it's broken until fairly long down the road, where the problem has been running for maybe weeks, maybe months, and you have a serious issue in your hands, right? So this is kind of the reality that looks like for enterprises that are thinking about AI, and why often we don't see more POCs reaching production, because the mountain of how do I put guardrails around this to actually get to production is fairly large. Fantastic. So the second part, we're going to talk, okay, so what do we do about it, right? Because it's good to talk about the problems, but we probably join this webinar because we would like to get some solutions. So what does governance that work on paper look like? So right now, I would say, and this is my recipe that I used with my customers and the companies I work at. So I'm sure other people have recipes, but these are the things that work for me. I based it in these 3 pillars around observability, predictability, and ownership. So let's deep dive a bit more in each of those. I'm gonna get some water before I do that. So what do I mean by observability? So when it comes to observability, I think it's a slightly different approach, right, than we had before. So normally we will look at observability and alerting as something where we look at the system and we want to know if we're getting errors in production, right? So are we getting some things in the traces that look like an error, therefore should be alerted? But as I mentioned before, really when we're talking about AI systems, the errors are less about a specific anecdotal incidents or issues that we may have in one conversation. And they are much more about when you aggregate a whole bunch of transactions, conversations, decisions that are being made by the AI, what is the percentage of what's the percentage of correctness that we were expecting? So first we need to have a way to measure whether that was correct or not answer, which is not a manual one. So again, sort of a way to evaluate it if the AI at that point took the right decision, or having a user verify that was the right decision, they were satisfied with the answer. But second of all is that we need to expect some level of errors, right? So here is similar to an API error rate where you're trying to understand, well, how much is good enough, right? So we know that there's going to be some errors, but what are the tolerance that we have? And is our system within those tolerance, or are they exceeded, right? So it's not so much looking at error logs, but aggregating those results, right? And do you have a system to do that? I think that's the first thing you need to put in place to be able to have that observability. The second part on that, which is, of course, you need to know that you have AI in production, which this sounds quite basic, but in some cases it's a challenge. So I would highly recommend to have an inventory of every model you have running and think about whether this is the right solutions you have in production that are observable, not just functional. So when I talk about like the provider's harness being opaque here, what I mean by that is often you get an API access to a model, and that's one thing, but often you get like more of a black box where you have the model, which could be, the typical large kind of frontier model providers from Google or Anthropic or OpenAI. But there is a harness in between from a third party that promise you, we the best at analyzing legal documents or at, solving this or that problem. So when you are putting this into production, what you put in there, it's a harness of a third party, which is basically prompt and context engineering around this model, maybe some fine tuning, but generally not, which is opaque to you. So any change to those prompts and to those harnesses would create an issue in terms of, are you able to observe that there's a change happened and what's the impact on their quality, right? So do I mean by that you should avoid that? I mean, not necessarily. You have to understand and really kind of go down and see what observability they have, but you need to be aware that this is a trade-off when you bring in a third-party harness that is basically implementing or kind of connecting to a frontier model. You're no longer just accessing the model and controlling, having observability and all the changes around the context that is being shared and prompted to the model, but this can become a bit more opaque, right? And finally, I think a key part of observability and sort of compliance here is to create an audit trail, right? So a lot of these systems allow you to provide an audit trail, but also can be in ways of setting yourself in the way to create an audit trail where both prompting data that being shared, tools being accessed by by the AI, it's important that it's generating an audit trail that you can play back what was, what was that access, both for compliance, but also from the quality point of view, right? To trying to identify why maybe your model is drifting in terms of quality of the results. So as usual, observability is a key part on that. So far, I don't know, Will, if you have any, that was clear, you had any questions on that?
I think, yeah, that was clear enough. I think we can move forward, and if there are questions, we can make it at the end. Yeah.
Sure. And then from a predictability point of view, which will be like the second pillar of the three, what do I mean by that? So like we have just talked about how AI is a kind of non-deterministic system. So Victor, why are you talking about predictability as a key pillar? Because I think we can move, and it's kind of probably recommended to think about why we're using AI for, right? So often it's a kind of hammer looking for a nail. And well, kind of I think AI has a very big role to play in product development. It's mainly around decision making and interpreting, extracting intent from actions from the user, or making decisions on based of what's happening in a system, right? Like what's the model of the system and what should be the next thing to happen. But then taking the action can be delegated to a more predictable system rather than allowing the generative AI to do this, because it's not going to be something that you can reproduce or you can sort of audit or like play back, right? So what I mean by that, so if in banking you are looking to create a system that it's going to create some transactions for you, I would much rather that this is created into a rule engine, or if you're going to or if you are going to sort of make some classifying decisions, maybe the AI can create you a ML model or some other sort of deterministic actions that can be taken. So by the way, like code, it's a deterministic action. So I've seen actual solutions where the AI interprets and writes on the fly small scripts and a small code to provide sort of some solutions that are more deterministic. But in general, trying to see what systems you can use that normally you're already using today. So there's a lot of financial systems that are rule-based, right? Whether it's for transaction monitoring or for banking transactions or whatever, that you can define rules. And maybe the AI can supplant these, the operator that will normally create those rules. But I would encourage you to connect it to a predictable system that can be audited, like a rule engine that can create these actions, right? That will be the second part. The first part, sorry. The second part will be, I think, to make sure that any guardrails you implement sit outside the model. What do I mean by that? By sitting inside the model, I mean trusting the model to guard itself by prompting it to, by the way, never do this. So, if you are talking to a customer, never give financial advice. It's say kind of you interpreted by the model as a guideline, not as a hard rule. So the model has always the option through reasoning to skip that, especially if it's prompted by the user repeatedly to do so, right? So any guardrails that you need to put in place to regulation need to sit outside the model reasoning and the model view into either connections to the harness itself or outside the harness in terms of, for example, what the example we were talking about, a conversation, financial advice, managing the prompts and the conversation that are going back and forth and filtering before it reaches the user, maybe using a different agent, maybe using a deterministic tool. But there's quite a lot of solutions out there where you can implement basically firewalls or like, man in the middle sort of situation where it will check that the prompt doesn't contain any language that shouldn't be there, whether it's sort of financial or otherwise inappropriate, like brand reputation and so on, but also that your responses are valid, right? So if somebody asks you for financial advice or your opinion on the World Cup final, for example, to pick a topic, you could say to the model, don't give an answer, but you could also screen the questions about it before it reaches the model by a different agent that is only specialized in this, or by a deterministic tool that classifies the question into, this is a question we don't want to answer, and serving a pre-canned answer, right? Like, I'm a financial model. I'm not here to talk about world news, or I can provide you financial advice, something like that, right? So the important thing is this guardrail sit outside of the model and never inside. And before you go into production with any models or any updates, the model, which would be like a third part of predictability, is to do testing. And then this is quite obvious that you should do testing, but like, in order to make this testing predictable and have a good framework around that, what you need to make sure is that sort of, it's not functional testing that you would do with code, pass, fail, happy path, no happy path. Is really, you're looking for statistically significant shifts on results. So here, synthetic data sets are quite important. You need to be able to run versions of the model, compare against the existing version of the model on a set of data, and ensure that the results are what you were expecting by creating both false positives, false negatives within the data, and making sure that the system behaves as you want it to. I will almost say, if you don't have this way of testing models, don't move anything into production. This is sort of a large safety net that you need to have, that allows you to kind of deterministically have some confidence that what you put in production isn't going to be an issue that becomes 2-3 months down the line a regulatory issue when the regulator comes to ask you, why did this happen, right? So these are kind of the things to be thinking about before production. As you can see, they're not simple. They are fairly complicated, and stuff that, if you haven't thought about it in a POC, might take some time to retrofit into it, and maybe why explains why POCs don't make it into production. But in the other hand, they can be done if you think about it from the beginning. Well, these two things are technical. I think the last one here is more organizational, which is around ownership, and especially for an enterprise, right? Like I said, smaller companies might have advantage here because it might be easier to know who owns what and what changes are happening. But in larger enterprises, you need a level of governance. You need every model that you're using in production to have an owner that is able to make decisions, and it's able to guard together with the governance framework that you have in place, to guard the production environments. And this is kind of the main things here. It's deciding when there should be a human in the loop, or whether or not it can be an autonomous decision. What's the threshold for that decision? How do you go around that? What data can be shared with AI and which one can't, right? Like, I think there are some nuances. It's not just a binary, this data cannot be shared, but it's also, what are you using the data for? And that's a decision, right? So obviously, probably don't upload credit card details to an AI. You should be doing that anyway. But beyond that, there is questions about, well, are you using it to make a decision on lending, right? Should you lend to this person or not? Like, that sort of can have some biases that are regulated by the EU Act, at least in Europe, but I'm sure other countries have equivalent, or economic areas have equivalent rules. And you need to be able to to basically make those decisions, so there's not so much black and white all the time of yes or no. So if you don't have ownership of someone that is able to get these questions escalated and make a decision, then you will find that it's a lot harder to move to production, because nobody owns that decision. No, I can assure you that nobody wants to own it. So unless you name an individual, I doubt anybody's going to stick their hand up. And and this is going to make your POC totally fail, because the hard questions, you won't have anyone with the accountability and the ownership to make a call on, right? And obviously documented and risk accepted, and decide, like, shepherd the company through this sort of risk acceptance process, which probably you have a process to risk accept, but you probably lack someone that is going to take this specific AI product and bring me through that, which I imagine will be a complex project with impact assessments around data, with kind of decisioning, introspections, and kind of deciding how to bring it to compliance to get the final approval of the risk. So that in a summary would be like the three pillars for governance, and kind of observability to know what's happening in production, predictability to make sure the agent it's making decisions, but you don't overly rely on something that is not deterministic to do day-to-day actions, but that you have some layers around it that set guardrails and also produce some kind of firewall around the model. And then finally, at the level of organization, having a clear ownership of who owns the model, who's making the decisions on what's human in the loop, what is not, what data can be shared, and that overall you can have a governance around the AI you have in production. And I think that's a good starting point to get from there. I think you have that in place. Your POC can become a product and be successful. But then there is more about it, right? That Will is going to talk a bit more about what's the next phase to take this into production.
Awesome. Thank you. So the third part for this presentation will be around the costs, right? So when governance is missing, you lose visibility over your AI systems, but there's a second thing that you lose visibility over, which are the costs, right? So some organizations that I work with went through a similar sequence. They built a business case for AI. They got a budget approved. They ran a pilot. They saw good results and a scale to production. But when the invoice arrived, it looked different from an initial projection. And what it usually happens is that the math that worked for a pilot, it doesn't really work that way when the architecture is changed or scaled, right? So with some numbers here, the situation that is sitting in many AI programs right now is that some token costs drop a certain number, like around 67, based on some official analysis over the last year, and blended costs went from $18 to $6 per million tokens between the first quarter of 2025 and the first quarter of 2026. And yet 73% of enterprises reported that their AI costs exceeded original projections. So the FinOps Foundation published that number in their paper, in their annual paper, and this tracks exactly what we can see in practice. So how do you square that? Price going down, invoice going up. So the answer is that the total spend is price per token multiplied by volume consumed, right? So the first variable is falling. The second one is growing faster than any budget model accounted for, because the volume assumptions that made sense for maybe a chatbot are wrong for an order of magnitude for an agentic system that is much more complex. And the third number is where the controllable part lives. Organizations running a tier model architecture, routing different tasks to different models based on their complexity, are paying close to $2 per million tokens on average, while other organizations that are routing everything to a single large frontier model are paying the highest amount for the same work, right? So 8 times the cost. And that gap is a direct financial consequence of what we can call an architectural decision, right? So when these organizations built their AI business case, they were probably thinking in a system like a chatbot. A user asks a question, the model answers it, the interactions ends there, right? So one API call, somewhere between maybe 500 to 2,000 tokens, which is predictable and easy to model, easy to budget. But if we compare it to an agentic solution, that works completely different. It doesn't answer one question and stop. It reads relevant files, it forms a plan, executes step by step. It checks if a certain output meets a defined criteria. And if it doesn't, it tries again and many times with the full conversation history. So that keeps growing, right? So that loop is what you see on the right side of this diagram, and that loop is why the math breaks. So a small team, controlling inputs, someone watching every output, the cost looks fine. Then you scale more users, more workflows, more loops running in parallel, and this is the gap that actually unrelated to the price per token that we see it's going down, right? So the different now that we established the volume problem, if we get more specific about how a high volume can come from, in practice there are, I think, three places that usually don't appear in the architecture or a budget definition. The first is called retrieval overhead. So most solutions in or AI deployments use the concept of RAG, retrieval augmented generation, which means that before your question reaches the model, a retrieval layer pulls relevant documents and injects them as a context. So it gives the model the information it needs to answer a particular input in a proper manner. So what that does to input token volume is that a query runs 4 to 6 times what a direct questions will cost. So you are paying for the question plus every document chunk that went with it. So if we multiply that for maybe 100,000 queries a month, you're billing much more than that, right? The second is the agent loop retries. Agents usually self-correct, which is a fantastic feature, but when an output doesn't meet the criteria, the agent resubmits. And when this happens, it resends the entire conversation history as a context, because typically the model has no memory between calls of the same resolution. So an agent running maybe 10 correction cycles can consume 50 times the tokens of a single linear pass, right? And the third is the background inference. So not all AI spends comes from user requests. There are other things that happen behind: document watchers, monitoring agents. These run continuously and consume tokens against events and document updates, right? So what these three have in common is that none of them are directly visible, right? So they are structural costs of how agentic systems actually work, right? And they are actually the reason that a drop in a token price hasn't translated into lower AI bills in many situations, right? Okay, so what we cover was the volume, where it comes from. Now the question is how is what you actually do about it, or what can you do? And the answer is not to use a cheaper model across the board. That's probably not the best instinct. Downgrading everything to save money is how you end up building like a bad quality system. So the answer is to stop treating all tasks as if they are having the same complexity, because they usually don't. So you need to think what your AI system actually does in a particular day or for a particular solution. There are tasks that really require top-level reasoning, maybe a complex flow that makes complex decisions. You need to handle ambiguity. You need to handle documents with probably sensitive information or contradictory information. So those tasks actually belong to what I will call a gold tier. These are like the best performing models nowadays. Claude, GPT, the best models available. They are expensive per token and probably worth for that particular tasks. Then I think there's everything else. Standard Q&A, document analysis, customer-facing responses, where a task is well-defined and the output is somehow predictable. So those belong to a silver layer. We can consider Close Sonnet, mid-tier models, solid quality, and you pay a fraction of that gold level cost. And then there's the high volume, well-defined, low complexity work that makes up the majority of most production workloads, which is classification, extraction, intent detection, routine logic. So we should consider that as a bronze. And then we can consider Llama, Qwen, DeepSeek. So open weight models running in a fraction per million tokens. So the economics of getting that right and running this kind of routed architecture will surely make a huge difference at the end of a billing cycle, right? And with this idea, we covered this part of about costs, but there's more about it, and Victor will talk about open weights and how it fits in a more sophisticated solution.
So, I mean, just going to the analogy you had before of like gold, silver, and bronze tier. So the examples you get there, like we were implying here that a bronze tier is mainly open weight, because to be honest, 2025 probably that was true. For who is watching this in 5 years from now, we are in 2026, and like Kimi K3 just been released a few weeks ago, and sort of hitting similar levels than Fable. But before that, there was GLM also hitting similar levels than Opus. So, I mean, whether we are there yet or not, I think what is true is that open weight models would be at least on the silver tier, if not now, very soon. I think probably they are already silver tier models, but even gold tier in the future. So keep in mind that, because obviously the cost associated to running a large language model of like gold tier is still large in terms of investment, even if you're hosting it yourself or you're paying that. And that's kind of what we want to cover, that it's really an architectural decision. It's not just a preference, or do I run do I run Opus or do I run GLM, right? So from that point of view, or even Sonnet and Qwen, right? So why would you go for? Because there is maybe a price part that comes into place, which we'll cover in a second. But largely, I think at this point, what I'm seeing in the industry, it's the large number, like the people I'm talking, well, in reality, I would say that most of the people I'm talking to in regulated entities are thinking about open weights. So it's on the table, and they are actively looking at where to use them. The number one reason why they're looking at that, it's two factors. One, it's digital sovereignty, meaning that there are real use cases. I mean, if you're more extreme, clear companies that have high security concerns, but not even that, but especially around medical data, where using something that the data leaves your environment, whether that's a cloud environment or a data center, is just not feasible. So the only option realistic to do that is looking at open weights. But beyond that, digital sovereignty in Europe is becoming quite important. The capacity of owning your own stack, not being hold to a supplier or a large entity like any of the kind of large producers of frontier models that I mentioned before, and kind of being able to, as an independent company, move this solution to a different infrastructure is not just a choice, but often it's something is regulated. So especially around regulations such as DORA, where you're looking for what's kind of resilience and how you're going to manage recovery. It's really hard to say, what's my recovery plan for OpenAI going down, sort of do I switch to kind of a GPT model, and what's the impact on that on the quality of what I'm producing? Because it's non-deterministic, right? So it's not as simple as saying I have a backup API connector for getting this data. This is sort of kind of changing a thinking engine, which either you're testing it and proving this, or it's becoming harder to say, how do you guarantee continuity of your service? So open weights models are a good solution for that, and something that's being considered. The second part of this is cost, right? And it's less about cost from a point of view of how much it costs me per token today, but how much may it cost me for token tomorrow, right? And sort of if you look at financial systems, this happens today, which is kind of what we call interest rate risks, right? So it's the equivalent of a bank lending you money for a mortgage for 20 years at a given rate without knowing what the money rate is going to go over the next 20 years, right? So they have a risk there, or if it goes really high up and I'm giving you low, then this can be a problem. So the same thing for a company that it's implementing a product. They're assuming certain costs, as you mentioned before in your slides, where, okay, what's my cost per token is X, and I have made a plan, and I'm, not just thought about a chatbot, but I've done it properly. But is this cost gonna stick around for quite a long time? And although cost models are going down, I think trust on companies and the billing, it's also going down. So things like Fable becoming, a paper usage instead of included in plans for code development, which is not kind of related to the really signal there is a move to higher monetization of closed models. And there is a question mark of how many of these companies will survive and in 2 to 3 years, because when you put these products in production in large regulated entities, you are thinking at least in a 5-year span, right? So in AI, this is like a whole, evolution can happen, but also maybe there's a consolidation and you're left with 1 or 2 players that decide to raise prices at that point, right? So overall, it's kind of that risk of what happens if, rather than today, it's cheaper, right? Because obviously you need to invest in CapEx, or you have to, kind of move to a solution that gives you this. And it is kind of something you need to consider, right? So these are the 2 main areas that I see people taking architectural decisions around open weights. And the third one I added here, which is kind of quality and provenance, is maybe a reason why people don't do it. So why the decision is not to go to open weights, and can be challenged. So one of it is what we were discussing: are open weights models good enough? And we can probably with all certainty say they are definitely bronze tier, good enough, and more. They probably, some of them from silver tier decision making, you could be using open weight models, and soon I think we can predict that soon that will be the case also for gold. So it's at the moment, if you are gold and silver, you're kind of having the question of, is this good enough for what I want? Which is a fair question, and then you need to evaluate it and do your tests. But often the question is also provenance. So a lot of these models come from, kind of a lot of the tier ones come from either, kind of Chinese companies, or there's kind of US companies and European companies. There's sort of a bit of, do you really understand the company that's coming from? Are they models that are being, retrieval engineered or really trained properly? What are the biases that have been introduced? Because I think that the biggest risk is not about data leaving your space, because I mean, in most of these cases, if you're concerned about digital sovereignty and the data that you're sharing, you probably have an air gap system, meaning that there is no way for data to leave your system. That's why you first of all moved into open weight models, assuming it wasn't cost. But beyond that, there are, they maybe have been trained on certain rules and kind of reinforcement training of do this, don't do that, which does not align with what your regulator expects, because they come from a different region where maybe certain things are allowed and other ones aren't, but it's sort of, there's a mismatch there, right? Of course, this can be fixed through some tests, and the advantage you have on open weight model compared to closed models is that you can fine tune them, and you can reinforce train them, right? So they're kind of different sort of approaches into submission of what your rules should be. But this is an additional cost for you. But it is a tool also that, not to forget that Western vendors also carry biases, and they are trained and developed by large companies that are moving very fast, so they're going to make mistakes, right? And maybe you don't have that option. So in a way, it's also a value added that you have this option to do that. So you should take all of this into consideration. There isn't a very clear answer here. It's probably, going back to what Will showed before, it's probably true to say you should be considering open weights models for sure for bronze tier from bronze tier loads or reasoning, just on a cost basis. But if you are, consider there are many options out there, from like cloud hosted solutions like AWS Bedrock to appliances that are pre-integrated with open models and NVIDIA hardware, for example, that to give you like out of the box, all in the box experience that simplifies a lot the maintenance. So there's a lot of emerging solutions. And I think there will be more and more coming, where you can sort of move from that also from a digital sovereignty point of view, and maybe still rely on the frontier models for closed models, but some of the other ones where maybe most of the volume is right now, and more of like your reliability and operations are going to be based or more impacted because of the volume. You can maybe think about, should I be adopting open weights as a solution? And that's really kind of all around that. I think it's still a judgment call based on your use case. There isn't like a single sort of rule, do this or do that, but it's definitely something to take into account. And I believe with this, we are at the end of the presentation and into the Q&A section.
That's right. We covered a lot of ground today, but we have time to answer a few questions. So Victor, one of the questions says, is the European AI Act actually being enforced, or is it still a theoretical risk? Can you comment about it?
I mean, I think I will say it's still at the risk stage. I wouldn't call it theoretical, because I think one of the things is that sort of we have seen the GDPR Act coming into place and have a very similar setup where you have fixed fines plus a percentage of your revenue, and people also were thinking about, well, is this going to be implemented or not? And then we saw the hammer come down hard on companies that weren't doing it. So I think from my experience, the customers I'm talking to and working with, they don't think this is a theoretical risk, but they do see it as a risk today more than sort of something that well, we 100% know exactly how the law is going to be interpreted, and there's not that many published, if anything, cases or fines. So they're still in those early stage, but definitely, I mean, I haven't come across anybody that is not taking this seriously in Europe, as the regulator will enforce it, and it's something that we need to follow, right? I have seen companies change regulations, even like locations, even kind of focus on customers outside the EU due to this. So I do think it's having an actual impact on a day-to-day.
Amazing. Then another question says, we are seeing our engineers adopt AI coding tools informally. How do you govern something that's already spreading bottom up?
Yes, I think so. This is kind of what normally refer as shadow AI. So normally, I think it is because there isn't an alternative for your developers or engineers to adopt it. So you are always going to have, engineers tend to be more on the early adopter curve, but not all of them are. So you're always going to have people that like to play with the latest and greatest toys, and you need to find a playground for them to do that. But the great majority of engineers, I think, are looking for a solution. So like the the difference between not using GenAI coding harness such as Codex or or Cloud Code versus using one, it's huge. So whether you're offering any of those or an open version like open code or a ID integrated version, whatever it is, I think the initial adoption curve you can sort of bring into the light by providing an actual solution and being clear. This is a solution you can use. This is the license, and reducing these barriers. Otherwise, when you are risking yourselves for like bigger risk and financial fines than what the license is going to cost you to permit, like for a tool, and which is a tool that has been it's been looked into. It's gone through the procurement process. It's had its impact assessments, so you will know how to control it going forward. And there are ways of introducing controls, but this is really hard when it stays in the shadows and people are doing their own thing. So in this case, definitely kind of legalizing AI for your engineers is the best way to stamp out everybody using different tools that they get on personal accounts or paid on a card and then expense it and stuff like that.
Amazing. There's one more quite interesting question. So there's a lot of pressure on CDOs right now to move fast with AI. How do you balance speed of development with the governance requirement that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think it's important. It's a very good question because it is true. I think on the other hand, similar to what you were saying before, that there is a lot of companies reporting that they're not seeing the value of this. And normally is because the adoption is being focused 100% on is your developer coding with AI, right? Or it's AI in the product in a chatbot that you mentioned before, and then not thinking about the stuff that we've been talking today. So it's very important to balance it with the regulatory governance around it to go into production, because this is where you're going to start seeing the value. Like often it's very compartmentalized in either engineers or a part of the product that doesn't have that much value because compliance is okay with you putting it there, but not in the core central area. And what you see is like quick adoption, but not much value coming out of it, right? So I think this balance, it's good also for reaching a balance between adoption and return on investment. So it's kind of similar. It goes hand by hand. And you really need to think about the end-to-end, and the end-to-end includes compliance, includes, if you are talking about productivity, so adopting it for development includes, what's fitting development and how is it getting to production, because often you accelerate the bottleneck of writing code, but not the rest. So the new bottlenecks appear. So the impact of having accelerated writing code is not so felt as the expectations were, right? And I think this is the same thing for product, right? So if you haven't really worked through compliance and like the regulations around it and so on, you'll end up playing on a part of the company that is not the critical part. So the impact that this is going to have, yes, you will have the label that you have AI in your product, but the impact that you're going to see in return on investment is probably not what you had expected or your sponsors had expected when they put that pressure to adopt AI, right?
Amazing. Great, Victor. So we covered all the questions, and we reached the end of this webinar. Thank you all for stopping by. This presentation will be available on YouTube if you'd like to review it in the future. So we are both available for your questions and support. So over to you, Victor, for a close.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. And as you mentioned, if you have any questions, don't doubt, feel free to reach out. You can reach me out through my website, which is kind of at the bottom of the screen, but like tucsonadvisory.com. You can reach me out in LinkedIn also. And yeah, let's keep the conversation. And again, thanks a lot for having me today in this webinar. It was really good fun to have this conversation.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone.